My name is Ryan Morrow. I was 31 when this happened. It was September 2021. I had just taken a break from work. I lived alone in a small apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina, and worked remote IT support, which meant I spent a lot of time staring at screens. I needed to get away. I wanted peace, space, and no cell signal. I needed real quiet, so I booked a small off-grid cabin near Pisgah National Forest, way out in the mountains. I took my dog with me. His name's Huck. He's a 5-year-old black lab, big guy, lazy when he's home but alert outdoors. I trusted him. If something felt off, he'd know before I would. The cabin was listed online as a secluded forest escape. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, no power, just a solar battery for lights, a wood stove, and a rain barrel for water. I packed food, a cooler with ice, and a portable camping stove just in case. I wanted isolation, and this place was really isolated, about 2 miles off the nearest road. You had to drive up an old fire trail that turned into nothing more than ruts between trees. Then you hiked the last quarter mile with your gear. The cabin was small, just one room with a small sleeping loft and a cot mattress, a little table, 2 chairs, the stove, and shelves with some pots and pans. No glass windows, just screens with wood shutters that could be latched from the inside. The toilet was an outhouse about 30 yards out back, and the only light was a single bulb rigged to a solar panel outside. We got there late afternoon. I parked in the dirt pull-off, unloaded the cooler and my bags, and led Huck through the woods to the cabin. He was excited, tail up, nose to the ground, sniffing everything. We didn't see anyone on the drive-in, not a soul. It was quiet, so quiet it made your ears ring. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees and thick undergrowth. No trails around it. No paths. Just forest. A place forgotten by time. I dropped my bag inside and sat on the edge of the little wooden porch. Huck flopped down beside me, panting hard from the hike. The sun filtered through the trees in streaks. Felt perfect. Quiet. I didn't even mind the outhouse or the fact the rain barrel was just a big drum with a lid. This was what I came for. That first night was uneventful. I made rice and beans on my camp stove outside, drank a warm beer from the cooler, and read by flashlight. Huck lay at the door, ears twitching at every forest sound. I rolled out my sleeping bag up in the loft and fell asleep fast. Huck curled up on the floor below me. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound, just a soft crunch. Leaves or sticks. My heart jumped a bit, but I told myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest's full of things like that. Huck didn't bark, but he stood up and stared at the door. I didn't move. I lay there, breathing shallow, listening. 1, 2, 3 soft crunches outside. Then silence. Huck didn't growl, just stood there, watching. After maybe 5 minutes, he lay back down. In the morning, I walked the area. Saw nothing. No prints, no broken twigs, nothing strange. I told myself I was just wound up from being alone in the woods. That day, I hiked down toward a small stream I'd seen on the map, about half a mile south. The terrain was steep, and I had to go slow. Huck stayed close. We got there mid-morning. Water was cold and clean. I filled a bottle, splashed my face, and sat for a while. Huck drank from the edge, then lay on a patch of moss, watching the trees. Always watching. It was peaceful, but I kept thinking about that sound from the night before. That soft crunch. Not fast like a squirrel. Not heavy like a deer. Just slow, even steps. I told myself again that it could have been anything. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I made a fire in the little pit outside and cooked some pasta. I still hadn't seen anyone in 2 full days.
No voices, no planes, no distant cars.
Nothing. That night, I double-latched the door and shut all the shutters. I felt a little tense, but again, nothing happened. Just the creak of trees and the usual forest noises. Still, I slept light. The next morning, I saw something that didn't make sense. About 20 yards from the cabin, a small branch had been stuck into the ground, upright, with a strip of cloth tied to it. It was dirty, faded blue. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't mine. Huck sniffed at it but didn't react much. I looked around, no footprints, no trash, no sign of people. Creeped me out. I pulled it out and tossed it deep into the woods. Later that day, I hiked a different direction, northwest, away from the road. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile again. I didn't want to get lost. When I turned back, I noticed Huck acting weird. His ears were up, and he kept pausing, looking behind us. Then he stopped completely and stared. I looked too. Nothing. Just trees. He didn't bark. He just stood there, stiff. Then after a minute, he started walking again. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., Huck barked. Not loud, just once. Then a low growl. I sat up fast. The growl kept going low and steady. I looked out one of the shutters but saw only dark. I turned off the lantern, sat still. The growl stopped. Huck stood at the door, tense. After a long moment, he walked in a slow circle around the cabin, ears up, tail low. He lay down after that, but I didn't sleep. In the morning, I saw prints outside. Human prints, barefoot. They were faint, like someone had walked lightly in the soft dirt just before dawn. I counted 3 sets. One came up from the woods, paused near the porch, then veered off back toward the trees. No trash, no tools, no signs of who. Just the prints. I felt sick. I didn't hear them, didn't see them, and Huck only barked once. I knew they were watching. Maybe the night before, maybe longer. I packed that morning. I was supposed to stay 3 more nights, but I wasn't about to wait around. I carried my bags to the car, Huck close beside me. The hike back felt longer. I kept turning around. I loaded the car fast. Huck jumped in and didn't even look out the window. He just stared straight ahead. I started the drive down the trail, bouncing over roots and dips. I hit the gravel road and finally relaxed a little. Then I saw something in the rear view. Something moved across the trail behind me. Just for a second. Person. I couldn't make out their face. They stepped out, then back into the woods.
No shirt.
Just bare skin and dark pants. I didn't stop. Back in town, I called the ranger station. Told them someone might be squatting near that cabin. They said they'd check it out. I didn't hear back. I didn't ask again. I kept thinking about the cloth on the stick, about how quiet that place was. Too quiet. About the footprints that came up close to the door barefoot. I kept wondering how many nights they were out there, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. What would have happened if I stayed one more night? I never went back. I haven't camped since. Huck sleeps in my room now by the door. He still reacts to certain noises, low growls at things I can't hear. But I trust him. He knew something was wrong before I did. I didn't make up anything about that trip. I didn't see a ghost or hear voices. No horror movie scenes. Just signs. Little things. A cloth on a stick. Footprints. A face in the trees. Real people can be worse than anything you imagine. And sometimes you don't realize how close danger is until it's already been standing right outside your door, waiting. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to get away from everything for a while. I was 31 at the time, working a high-stress job at a tire factory in northern Indiana, and I'd been feeling stretched thin for months. My sister, who lived near La Crosse, Wisconsin, had inherited an old farm from our uncle who had passed away a few years earlier. It was way out in the country, almost 2 hours from the nearest gas station and even farther from anything resembling a town. She wasn't doing anything with it and told me I could use the old cabin on the property if I wanted to get away. I jumped at the offer. The drive up was quiet. I left early on a Saturday morning in late June. The skies were overcast and stayed that way the whole trip, making everything look a little more gray than usual. It was the kind of day where the clouds hang low enough to feel like they're pressing down on the ground. By the time I turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, my phone had already lost service. I remember thinking that was exactly what I needed. No work calls, no texts, no emails. The land stretched for what felt like miles in every direction. Just fields, some small wooded patches, and a broken fence line that had long since given up trying to keep anything in or out. The cabin sat about a quarter-mile from the main gravel road, tucked at the edge of a tree line that bordered a long, mostly empty cornfield. It was old, built probably in the 1940s or earlier. Just one story, sagging porch, faded green roof, and paint that had long since peeled away. The windows were dusty and cracked at the edges, and the screen door was hanging on by one hinge. It smelled of dry wood and dust inside, but it was clean enough. The furniture was worn out but functional. An old couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a twin-sized bed in the corner. The kitchen had a propane stove, an old sink with a hand pump, and some shelves that were still stocked with canned beans and flour. I brought my own food, so I didn't need any of it. There was no electricity. My sister warned me about that ahead of time. She told me to bring lanterns, which I did. I also brought a cooler with ice and enough food for 2 weeks. I planned to stay for just one, long enough to clear my head. There was an outhouse a few dozen feet behind the cabin and a rusty water tank near the trees. It was quiet, unnervingly quiet. No cars, no voices, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent most of the time sitting on the porch, drinking instant coffee, and reading old paperbacks I hadn't touched in years. I'd wake up with the sun, walk the property, and eat simple meals. At night, I'd sit in the cabin with the lantern burning low, writing in a notebook or just listening to the night sounds. The place had a calming effect, though I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. I chalked it up to being unused to the isolation. City life made me forget how loud silence could be. It was on the 3rd night that I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. I'd gone to bed a little after 10 p.m. The air was thick and warm, and I left one window cracked to let in a breeze. I woke up around 2 a.m., unsure why. It wasn't a noise, at least not one I remembered, but I felt wide awake like something had pulled me out of sleep. I stayed in bed, listening. The wind had died down, and the crickets had gone quiet. It was that complete silence that you don't usually notice until something breaks it. I heard a faint crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry grass. It was soft but steady. I lay completely still, holding my breath. The sound moved slowly around the side of the cabin, then paused. I heard the screen door creak. Not a full open, just the creak of tension in the hinge. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I just sat there in the dark, waiting. After about a minute, the sound stopped. I finally turned on the flashlight and swept it across the room. Nothing. I got out of bed and quietly walked to the window. I couldn't see much, just the outline of trees and the empty field beyond. I stood there for a few minutes before going back to bed. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. There were faint boot prints in the dirt outside. Not fresh enough to be certain they were from that night, but I didn't remember seeing them before. They circled the cabin once and disappeared toward the tree line. I thought maybe a hunter had wandered onto the property. It wasn't impossible. My sister told me she hadn't been out here in over a year. Still, the idea of someone walking around at night unsettled me. That day, I kept my eyes open. Every little noise got my attention. I kept my flashlight and a knife by the bed that night. I slept in short bursts, waking up at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard the crunching again. This time it was slower. I could track the sound around the side of the cabin. stopped near the porch. I sat up in bed, holding the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, too nervous to move. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the sound of something dragging along the outside wall. Not claws, more like fingers. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After another few seconds, the dragging stopped. Then I heard nothing. I stayed like that for hours until the first light of dawn started coming through the window. That morning, I found fresh marks on the side of the cabin. Just shallow grooves along the wood siding, like someone had dragged a stick or tool across it. I also found a footprint at the bottom of the steps. It was clearer this time. Work boot tread. Same direction, toward the treeline. I thought about leaving then, but something about the situation made me angry. I felt like I was being messed with. Stalked, maybe. But the land was so far from anything that I couldn't understand why anyone would go through that kind of effort just to scare me. I decided to stay one more night. Just one. I didn't go far that day. I stayed close to the cabin and checked the woods briefly, but I didn't see anyone. Around sunset, I set up a small fire just off the porch and cooked a hot meal. I kept the flashlight and knife in my lap the whole time. When I finally went back inside, I left the lantern off. I figured if someone was watching, I wouldn't give them a target. I stayed awake all night. I sat in the dark, listening. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard it again. Steps in the grass. But this time, they came from a different direction. Not from the woods, from the field. Slow, deliberate steps. They stopped just short of the cabin. I could hear breathing outside the window, low and steady. Not loud, but unmistakable. I kept the knife tight in my hand. I didn't move. I thought maybe if I waited, they'd leave. But they didn't. I heard the screen door creak again. Just once. Then something pressed slowly against the wooden door behind it. Not enough to open it, just enough to make it groan. I stayed frozen. It stayed like that for maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped. Footsteps retreated. Same slow pace. Back across the yard. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared to move. That was it for me. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw my bag into the truck and took off. The drive out felt like it took hours. I didn't stop until I got back to the main road and finally saw another car. My phone came back to life about 15 miles later. I had no signal out there the entire time. When I got home, I called my sister. I told her what happened, every detail. She didn't say much. She just told me she'd send someone to check the property. A week later, she called back and said the sheriff's deputy who went out found signs of someone squatting in the woods just beyond the cornfield. There was a small makeshift shelter and signs of recent campfires. Whoever it was, they were gone by the time the deputy got there. She had the place boarded up and didn't offer it to anyone again. It's been over 10 years now, but I still think about that trip sometimes. I think about how close that person got to the cabin, how they circled it, how they stood at the window. I think about the sound of their breathing through the screen. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a real person. That's what makes it worse. Someone had been watching me. Someone out there had been waiting, and they were patient. The road had been rough and narrow for miles, winding deep into the heart of the Oregon woods. I'd driven my old pickup as far as it could go before the gravel faded into nothing but dirt and loose stones. My destination was a small, long-forgotten cabin marked on an old map I'd found in the back of a local library. The cabin wasn't on any current GPS, and the area was known for being sparsely traveled. I was 28 years old, a photographer with a keen interest in abandoned places and the stories they held. I'd grown up near the city, but my weekends had increasingly been spent chasing history and isolation in the wild. This cabin, rumored to have been deserted for decades, called to me as a perfect subject for my next project, a photo essay about forgotten rural life in the Pacific Northwest. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tall evergreens as I parked my truck beside a fallen log. I stepped out, the air cool and thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It had rained the night before, leaving the forest floor soft and slightly muddy. I took a deep breath and hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, feeling the weight of my camera gear and supplies settle into place. The last stretch of the path was overgrown with weeds and brambles, as if no one had walked it in years. I pushed through branches and stepped carefully over roots, ears alert for any sounds beyond the usual forest hum. The rustling of small animals, the distant call of a crow, the whisper of the wind through the needles. I had been warned by locals not to wander too far in this area. Stories of trespassers getting lost or turning back early were common. But I felt confident and curious, confident that I was prepared, curious about what I would find. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I saw it, the cabin barely visible through the trees. It was small and worn, sitting crookedly on a slight hill. The wooden planks that formed its walls were gray and splintered, some missing altogether. The roof sagged in the middle, covered in moss and patches of old metal sheets that might once have been tin. The windows were broken or boarded up, except for one small pane that reflected the fading light. I walked around the cabin slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of decay. A rusted old metal bucket lay near the porch, half buried in dirt and leaves. A collapsed stone chimney stood to one side, bricks scattered like fallen teeth. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned for at least 50 years, left to rot in the damp forest. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a faint musty smell. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet. Sunlight filtered in through the holes in the roof and broken windows, casting patterns on the walls. The cabin's interior was empty except for a few remnants: a broken chair, a rusted stove, and a small table with a cracked mirror. I began setting up my camera, trying to capture the eerie silence and stillness. The light was fading fast, so I worked quickly, taking photos of every detail: the peeling wallpaper, the layers of dirt on the floor, the spider webs hanging from ceiling beams. After a while, I stepped outside to stretch and check my phone. No signal as expected. The isolation felt real now, and a slight chill crawled up my neck despite the mild evening temperature. As darkness deepened, I realized I was going to have to spend the night if I wanted to finish the shoot. I had brought a small tent and some supplies in my pack. The idea of staying overnight in a cabin with no power or running water was a little unsettling, but the excitement of the project pushed me forward. I chose a spot near the cabin, on slightly higher ground, and pitched my tent. The forest around me seemed to close in tighter as night came. The sounds changed. The rustle of leaves grew louder. Branches tapped against each other like quiet whispers. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. I lit a small camp stove and boiled water for coffee, trying to calm the slight nervousness growing inside me. As I sat outside my tent, drinking the hot coffee, I noticed something strange. The forest, which had felt empty and silent earlier, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of movement and sounds I couldn't quite place. Twigs snapped far off in the dark, just out of sight. Leaves rustled without any obvious cause. The hairs on my arms stood up. I reminded myself it was just the forest coming alive at night, nothing more. But I felt eyes on me, even though no one was there. I scanned the shadows with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but trees and underbrush. Later, curiosity drove me back to the cabin. I took my flashlight and stepped inside again. The air felt colder now, damper. I moved slowly, shining the light over the old wood and debris. On the table, something caught my eye: a small stack of yellowed papers tied with a faded ribbon. Carefully, I untied it and unfolded the top sheet. It was a letter written in a shaky hand. The ink was faded, but I could make out some words. It spoke of hardship, loneliness, and fear. The writer had lived there alone, worried about people passing through, concerned about safety. The letter mentioned a few visitors who came asking questions about the land, but none stayed long. As I read, a sudden noise startled me. A sharp crack from outside, like a branch breaking. I froze, listening. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, and returned the papers carefully. I stayed inside the cabin for a little longer, exploring the small room. In a corner, I found an old tin box, rusted shut. Using a rock from outside, I broke it open. Inside were a few coins, some faded photographs, and a pocket knife. The photos showed a man and a woman standing in front of the cabin, smiling but worn from years of hard work. I guessed they were the original owners. I slipped everything back inside the box and placed it under the table. It felt like a small connection to the people who had once called this place home. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the broken windows. The cabin seemed to creak and moan as if alive. I grabbed my gear and hurried outside, the night air biting my skin. Back at my tent, I tried to sleep, but every noise made me jump. I lay awake, hearing footsteps crunching in the distance, shadows shifting just beyond the tent's thin walls. At some point, I heard voices, low, muffled, just beyond the trees. I didn't recognize the language, but they were definitely human. I held still, heart pounding. Maybe other campers or hunters nearby. The forest was known to have occasional visitors, but the voices stopped suddenly, and silence returned. The weight of isolation pressed down on me again. By morning, the sun filtered softly through the canopy, and the forest looked calm and welcoming. The eerie tension of night was gone. I packed up my tent and gear, wanting to leave but feeling a strange reluctance. Before I left, I took one last walk around the cabin, snapping final photos of the morning light touching the moss and the broken wood. The place, though abandoned and falling apart, held a quiet dignity. The people who had lived here had struggled against time, weather, and loneliness. The cabin was their mark, slowly returning to the earth. As I walked back to my truck, the forest seemed peaceful, the strange noises of the night now just part of the wild world. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and gratitude. I had found what I came for. Not just pictures, but a story etched in wood and dirt, of human life lived quietly in the shadows. I knew I wouldn't forget that night, the way the dark had felt so close, the way the forest seemed to watch and listen. But I also knew that sometimes, what scares us most is simply the unknown, the loneliness of a place left behind, and the natural wildness that never truly sleeps. That cabin, abandoned and forgotten, was a reminder of something older and deeper than any ghost story. The reality of survival, isolation, and the passage of time. And for me, that was enough. Back in the fall of 2013, I took a break from work after a rough year. I had just turned 32, and I felt burned out, completely worn down. I worked as a freelance contractor, mostly doing wood refinishing and restoration. It paid well when jobs came in, but the physical work left me tired all the time. After dealing with a difficult divorce and a back injury that sidelined me for 3 months, I decided I needed time away. A real break. No phone, no emails, no jobs. My cousin Mike had an old hunting cabin up in eastern Oregon, near the Wallowa Mountains. It sat deep in a patch of private land that hadn't been used much in the past decade. Mike hadn't been up there himself in years, but he gave me the okay to use it as long as I wanted. He even mailed me the old key. There was no power, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a hand pump well about 30 yards from the front porch, and a small outhouse behind the tree line. It was early October when I drove up. I left Pendleton around noon and arrived just before sundown. The dirt road leading to the cabin wasn't in great shape, washed out in some spots and overgrown in others. I drove my old Tacoma through it slow, hoping I wouldn't get stuck. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood there just as Mike described. Small, a little slanted, with that gray weather-beaten wood that made it look like part of the trees around it. I unpacked what I had: canned food, rice, some trail mix, jerky, a camping stove with extra propane, and a .30-06 hunting rifle I inherited from my dad years back. Not for hunting, just in case. I wasn't planning on seeing anyone, and I sure wasn't planning on being seen. That was the whole point, to disappear for a while, reset. The first few days were calm. I chopped wood, boiled water, kept to myself. The mornings were cool, with fog hanging low in the valley. Nights got cold, dropping into the 30s, and the wood stove became essential. I kept a small fire going most of the time just to keep the chill out of the air. Around the 5th night, things started to feel different. Not bad, just odd. I'd be sitting on the front porch reading or just watching the trees sway, and I'd get that feeling like I wasn't alone. You know the one, when the hairs on your arms stand up for no reason, and you keep glancing behind you like something might be there. I chalked it up to being alone. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. In the city, there's always something humming, a siren in the distance, a car engine, something. Out there, it was dead quiet, but that feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. On the 7th night, I heard something outside. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and I had just gone to bed in the little cot by the stove. The fire was mostly out, just a few red coals. I was just drifting when I heard twigs snap outside, like someone walking. Not a deer, not heavy, but not light either. And it wasn't a four-legged shuffle. It sounded like careful steps, one at a time. I sat up and listened, heart picking up a little. The cabin had one window, covered with an old wool blanket nailed at the top. I couldn't see anything, but the steps circled the cabin slowly, not rushing, not dragging. Just a single crunch, then another, then nothing for a few seconds, then again. I grabbed the rifle, not because I thought I needed it, but because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't call out. I didn't shine a light. I just sat there in the dark, listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I didn't hear footsteps walking away. They just stopped. I sat there for an hour, waiting for something more, but nothing happened. Next morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't see anything. No prints, but the leaves had fallen thick, and the ground was damp. Hard to tell. Still, something had been there, or someone. That afternoon, I made a long circle around the area, maybe a half-mile loop through the trees, just looking. I found a few old deer trails, a crushed bush here and there, but no boot prints, no campsites, nothing human. I stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day. I had this creeping feeling like I was being watched. I kept looking into the trees, like something was there just behind them, just far enough to stay hidden. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, just a flash, like someone slipping behind a tree. But I'd stare and stare, and nothing would be there. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the rifle close and sat in the chair by the stove with the fire built up high. I didn't want to lie down. My ears kept playing tricks on me. Wind would blow and I'd hear a whisper. A branch would scrape the side of the cabin and I'd jump. At one point, I swore I heard breathing just outside the door. Not loud, but slow, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. Sometime near dawn, I finally nodded off from exhaustion. But I was up again by 8, stiff and groggy. I was starting to feel the pressure. I hadn't seen a single person in a week, and now I was afraid someone was out there messing with me. I thought maybe a squatter or a hunter stumbled on the cabin and decided to play games. But they hadn't knocked. They hadn't shown themselves. That's what made it so bad. The silence, the watching. On day 9, I hiked down to the stream a mile from the cabin. I needed fresh water, and I wanted to clear my head. The walk was calm at first. The trail was quiet, just wind in the trees, birds chirping. I even started to think I was imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But when I came back, I found something that stopped me cold. There were boot prints in the clearing. Not mine. I was wearing heavy hiking boots, size 12s. These were smaller, narrower, like someone in running shoes or lighter boots. They came from the tree line behind the cabin and stopped near the porch, then turned around and went back. No reason for anyone to be out here. The land belonged to Mike's uncle, and it hadn't been used for hunting in years. No marked trails, no signs of other camps. And these prints hadn't been there in the morning. I started thinking about heading back early, but I didn't want to run. I was stubborn. I thought if I just waited it out, whoever was out there would get bored. That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle beside me again. I barely moved. I was just waiting, heart racing every time the fire popped or the wind shifted. Around 3 a.m., the doorknob rattled. Not loud, just a slow jiggle. I froze. It lasted a few seconds, then silence. Nothing more.
No footsteps.
No shadow in the window, just that one sound. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I made up my mind. I packed everything into the truck. I didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. I just wanted to get out. I left the cabin by 7, engine cold, tires crunching the frosty leaves. But not even a mile down the dirt road, I found something else. On the side of the trail, propped against a tree, was a pile of stones, stacked carefully, balanced even, like a marker. I didn't stop. I didn't take a picture. I just kept driving. It took 2 hours to reach the main road. I drove straight back to Pendleton and stayed at a motel on the edge of town. I locked the door. I kept the curtains shut. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had followed me. I felt eyes on me even in the city. In the weeks after, I told Mike. He laughed at first, said I was probably seeing deer or raccoons. But when I mentioned the boot prints and the door handle, he got quiet. He told me he'd only ever been up there a handful of times, and he didn't know anyone who'd go out there on foot. I didn't go back. Still haven't. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in skinwalkers or witches or any of that stuff. But I do believe people can be monsters. And I think someone was out there watching me for days. Maybe more. Someone who knew I was alone and waited for night to come before stepping out from the trees. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were planning something worse. I don't know. But that cabin, quiet and peaceful as it looked from the outside, was the scariest place I've ever been. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. And I'll never go back. It was in the fall of 2017. I was 34 then. I had just left my job in a warehouse in Kansas City after 10 years and decided to take a few months off before finding something new. I was single, no kids, and I had some savings to float on. I figured I'd use the time to get away from everything. City noise, stress, phones buzzing, all of it. A guy I used to work with told me about a small hunting cabin his family owned up in northern Arkansas. Said they didn't use it anymore. No one had gone up there in years. I asked if it had power or running water. He said no, but it had a wood stove, some cots, and a roof that didn't leak. That was good enough for me. I loaded up my old 2002 Silverado with supplies. Food, a camp stove, a couple of water jugs, sleeping bag, extra gas, and a small generator I had bought at a pawn shop. I even brought a rifle, not because I was hunting, but just to be cautious. I've always been the kind of guy who'd rather have it and not need it than the other way around. The cabin sat a few miles past a rock quarry that was out of business now. The road to it wasn't even a road anymore, more like a trail half swallowed by grass and brush. I had to crawl along in four-wheel drive to avoid getting stuck. I reached the cabin just after noon the first day. It looked pretty much how I expected, small, square, made of old wood that had grayed from years of sun and rain. A little porch sagged in the front. Trees surrounded it on all sides, thick and tall, stretching forever. I remember thinking it was perfect. Inside, the air smelled stale, like dry wood and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners and a couple of mice droppings on the floor, but otherwise it was solid. The place had one main room, a little cast iron stove in the center, a table made from 2x4s, and a narrow door in the back that led to a tiny room with 2 bunk beds. A rusted lantern hung from a nail, and an old pair of boots sat in the corner like someone had just stepped out of them and never came back. The first 2 days were quiet, peaceful. I'd wake up with the light, make coffee on the camp stove, sit on the porch and just listen. No traffic, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of branches in the woods. I chopped some wood from a dead tree nearby and stacked it beside the stove. Nights were colder than I expected, but I liked the quiet so much I didn't mind. I'd fall asleep to the sound of the fire popping. On the third day, things started to feel off. Not big, not loud, just off. I went out in the morning to refill my water jugs from a small creek about a half-mile east of the cabin. The trail I made to it was already starting to disappear. I had tied a red shirt to a tree branch near the cabin to mark the way, and that morning, it was gone. I thought maybe the wind had blown it off or something. I looked around and saw it laying about 10 feet off the trail, draped over a stump. It hadn't fallen there. It was tied, knotted onto the stump like someone had placed it that way. I stood there for a second just staring at it, trying to think if maybe I had tied it somewhere else and forgot. But I knew I hadn't. I'm not forgetful like that. I brought the water back, shook it off, and tried not to overthink it. Could have been a hunter, I told myself. Maybe a local kid messing around. But there weren't any other cabins around, no nearby towns within walking distance, and I hadn't seen a single person since I drove off the highway 3 days earlier. That night, I kept the rifle by the cot. On the 4th day, I went exploring. I had a map printed off the internet that showed an old fire trail looping west of the cabin through a hollow. I figured I'd follow it for a couple of miles, maybe take some pictures, stretch my legs. I was out for about 2 hours. Didn't see much. Just trees, dry leaves, the remains of an old deer stand halfway rotted on a birch tree. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. It hadn't been that way when I left. I know I shut it. I had even wedged a little stone under it to keep it from swinging open in the wind. The stone was gone. I froze just standing outside the clearing for a minute, watching. Nothing moved. No sound. I waited another few minutes before stepping onto the porch. I opened the door all the way with the barrel of the rifle. The inside looked untouched at first, but then I noticed my backpack was moved from the table to the floor. The zipper was half open. A can of beans I had left on the shelf was sitting on the table, even though I'd packed it away the night before. Nothing was taken. Whoever had been there didn't steal anything. They just moved stuff, like they wanted me to know they'd been inside. I searched the woods around the cabin until sunset, shouting out a few times even though I didn't expect an answer. I didn't find anyone.
No boot prints. No cigarette butts.
No trail. That night, I didn't sleep much. I locked the door from the inside and stacked 2 chairs under the handle. Kept the fire small so the light wouldn't show through the cracks in the wall. I sat there in the dark, rifle across my lap, heart pounding at every creak or thump. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps, slow, heavy ones, outside, crunching leaves. They stopped near the porch. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The fire was just coals then, casting weak orange light around the stove. My eyes were wide open. I didn't dare stand up. Then the footsteps moved again, this time circling the cabin, crunching around the side toward the back. Then nothing. I waited until morning before I moved. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped out with the rifle. The ground was disturbed. Someone had definitely walked around the cabin. The dirt was packed down in places like someone had stood there for a long time. But no clear boot prints, just scuffs and pressed leaves. Whoever it was had been smart, careful. I should have left then. I know that now, but I didn't want to feel like I was running. I kept telling myself it could have been a poacher, maybe someone squatting on old land, someone who didn't like people nearby. I was just a visitor. I figured maybe if I made it clear I wasn't staying long, they'd back off. That afternoon, I gathered my things and packed them tight. I planned to leave the next morning. I even loaded the generator into the truck bed. The rest of the gear I kept inside for one more night. At sunset, I saw smoke in the trees, thin and gray, rising about a quarter mile off to the east. Someone else had a fire going. I stared at it for a long time, then went back inside and kept the lantern off. Just before it got dark, I nailed a piece of wood across the door from the inside, not because I thought it would stop anyone, but because I wanted them to know I wasn't going to let them come in again without a fight. That last night was the worst, not because something happened, but because it didn't. I sat there, every second waiting for the sound of footsteps, a knock, a whisper, a movement, but nothing came. Just silence so heavy it felt like I could hear the trees thinking. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I just sat on the edge of the cot, eyes stuck on the door, holding the rifle with both hands until the morning light started to creep through the boards. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I packed the last of my things, took one last look around, and left. When I stepped off the porch, I found a dead bird nailed to a tree 10 feet from the cabin. A crow, stiff and gray-eyed. Its wings spread out like it had been pinned mid-flight. Below it, scratched into the bark, were 3 deep lines, just gouged like claws or a blade had raked it. That was it. That was the final message. I drove the truck fast down the old trail, bouncing and jolting over roots and rocks, not caring if I broke something on the undercarriage. I didn't stop once until I hit the highway 2 hours later. I didn't look back, didn't even tell the guy who gave me the cabin's location what had happened. I just said thanks and left it at that. It's been years since that trip. I still think about it. I think about the fact that nothing supernatural happened.
No ghosts, no monsters.
Just a presence, person, maybe more than one. Someone who didn't like me there. Someone who watched me from the trees, moved my things, stepped around my cabin at night, and left signs to let me know they could have done worse. I never went back. I never will. That cabin is probably still up there, sagging deeper into the earth, swallowed by trees. Whoever was out there may still be out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they're alone. But they won't be. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to take that trip back to the cabin. Not my cabin, not my place, but the one my ex-husband, Mark, had owned for years before we split up. We had been divorced almost 2 years by then, and life was still finding its balance, but something about that cabin called me, or maybe I just needed to face the past. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods of northern Vermont, close enough to a small town but far enough to feel cut off from the world. Mark had always talked about how peaceful it was, surrounded by the thick forest and a small lake just a few hundred feet behind the clearing where the cabin sat. I remember visiting once or twice before the divorce, but I never stayed long. It was his place, his refuge. The road leading up to the cabin was a narrow dirt path that twisted through tall pine trees, their needles rustling in the cool autumn wind. The leaves were turning colors, yellow, orange, and red, and the air had that sharp bite that only October could bring. I pulled my old sedan onto the gravel clearing in front of the cabin and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. No birds singing, no sounds of other people, just the occasional creak of branches swaying. The cabin itself was modest, nothing fancy. A single story with rough wooden siding that was weathered and stained from years of rain and snow. The windows were dusty, but I could see the curtains Mark had hung thick, dark green, blocking much of the light inside. I took my backpack from the back seat and locked the car, feeling the cold settle in my bones already. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and faintly of old smoke from a stone fireplace that had clearly been unused for some time. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved around, setting down my things on a small table near the door. There was a rustic kitchen on the left, a sink with a few dirty dishes, a stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months, and a battered refrigerator humming quietly. I decided to make a fire. The cabin's fireplace was the heart of the place, and I needed that warmth. Mark had always been particular about firewood, stacking it carefully outside the back door. I grabbed a handful of dry logs, laid them inside the fireplace, and used some old newspaper to start the fire. Slowly, the flames caught, crackling and throwing flickering shadows across the walls. The first night was cold and quiet. I lay on the old mattress that was pushed against the far wall, wrapped in a thick wool blanket I had brought with me. The cabin felt empty but heavy, like it was holding on to all the memories of a life I once had. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden walls, and every creak sounded louder than it should have. I stayed awake longer than I expected. The isolation was harder than I thought. There was no phone signal out here, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the cold night, surrounded by trees that felt like silent watchers. The next morning, I woke early to a gray sky. The air was damp, and a light drizzle had started outside. I pulled on my boots and jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The smell of wet earth and pine filled my lungs. I looked toward the lake and saw the surface was still, almost glassy under the low clouds. There was no sign of life, no ducks or squirrels, just the quiet of the forest after the rain. I decided to explore the area, thinking the fresh air might clear my mind. The path to the lake was muddy, the ground soft beneath my feet. The trees here were tall and close, their trunks dark and wet from the rain. As I walked, I tried to push the memories away. The fights with Mark, the cold silences, the final night when everything fell apart. But the forest seemed to hold those moments in its silence, pressing them back into my mind. By midday, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. I noticed something odd as I walked back toward the cabin. Tire tracks in the mud. Fresh tracks. They weren't mine or Mark's. They were recent, probably from just hours ago. They led off the path into the trees, ending about 50 yards from the cabin near a pile of old, rotting logs. I felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. Who else could be out here? This place was supposed to be abandoned and used since Mark stopped coming. I had told myself I was alone, but these tracks suggested otherwise. I hurried back to the cabin and double-locked the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was probably a local hunter or someone passing through, but a knot of unease settled in my stomach. That night, I kept the fire going longer and sat by the window, watching the dark woods. The silence was broken only by distant animal sounds and the occasional snap of a twig outside. I convinced myself it was just the forest, nothing more, but sleep was restless. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something scraping against the cabin's exterior. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the wall, but then it became more deliberate. A slow, steady scraping noise that moved around the side of the cabin. My heart pounded. I stayed frozen, staring into the dark window, trying to see through the blackness. Then a shadow moved, not just a tree or branch, but a figure, crouched and shifting near the corner. My breath caught. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The scraping stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence again. I didn't dare open the door. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a heavy iron poker I found near the fireplace. Every noise outside made me jump. I thought about the tire tracks and what kind of person would be out here in the middle of nowhere at night. Morning felt like a blessing. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside, armed with a large branch I found nearby. The forest was calm again, but the ground around the cabin told a different story. Footprints circled the clearing, not from any animal. They were human, large boots, messy and fresh. I followed the prints carefully, the branch held ready. They led toward the woods but stopped abruptly near a thick patch of bushes. I looked carefully but saw no sign of anyone hiding. I decided to stay inside the cabin the rest of the day. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, and every little sound sent me scrambling for cover. I stayed up that night, fully alert, watching every window and door. The fire had burned low, but I didn't want to get up to tend it. The scraping never came again, but I wasn't convinced I was alone. On the third day, I made a plan. I couldn't stay here forever, not with whoever had been outside. I packed my things carefully, keeping the iron poker close. Before leaving, I searched the cabin thoroughly, checking every corner, every closet, even the attic crawl space. No one was there, but signs of recent presence outside made me certain I had to leave soon. As I loaded my car, I heard a noise behind me. A low grunt, maybe an animal or maybe not. I froze. The woods were quiet again, but the feeling that someone was close was unbearable. I jumped into the car and locked the doors. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't look back again. In the weeks after, I told myself it was just some hunter or drifter looking for shelter, maybe someone struggling with their own demons. But I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that settled deep inside. That cabin was never just a place for Mark. It was a trap, and I was lucky to get out. It was the summer of 2019 when I found myself out in the remote woods of northern Vermont, in a small glass cabin I had rented for a week. The place was tucked away from any real civilization, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through thick forest. I was 38 years old, and this was supposed to be a chance to get away from the noise of my everyday life. A break from the city, from work, from the endless stream of emails and phone calls. The cabin was modern but minimalistic. It was mostly glass walls on all sides, with a sturdy wooden frame and a small stone foundation. The roof was flat, made of thick glass panels too, so when you looked up, you could see the sky and the treetops around you. Inside, there was a simple bed, a small kitchen corner with a gas stove and fridge, and a tiny bathroom with a shower. The floors were polished wood, and there was a fireplace, but I never had a need to use it. The cabin was perfect for someone like me who wanted to be surrounded by nature, but still have some comfort. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive. The sun was beginning to dip low, and the light through the trees was golden and soft. I unloaded my things from my old Jeep, a duffel bag with clothes, some food, a couple of books, and a small camera to document the trip. The nearest town, St. Johnsbury, was about 25 miles away, but it felt like a world apart from here. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, sat on the little deck outside the cabin, and watched the sun set. The woods around me were full of sounds, the calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt calm and detached, a nice contrast to the rush of city life. The next day, I planned to hike. The cabin's owner had left a trail map inside, and I wanted to explore a few marked paths nearby. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, my phone, and the camera. The weather was warm but not hot. The sky mostly clear with a few scattered clouds. The trails were well marked at first but quickly became narrower and more tangled. I walked for hours, climbing small hills and crossing little streams. The forest was thick and dense, mostly pine and maple trees, with a carpet of fallen needles and leaves underfoot. I took pictures of interesting trees, a squirrel darting across the path, and the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I expected. The trail markers had become fewer and harder to find. I stopped to check my phone, but the signal was weak and unreliable. There was no GPS signal, no maps downloaded, and no way to call anyone. For the first time, I felt a slight knot of worry in my stomach. I decided to turn back, retracing my steps carefully. But the forest around me seemed different now. The trees looked denser, the shadows longer. I passed a fallen log and saw scratch marks on the bark, deep and ragged, like something big had clawed at it. I didn't want to think about what kind of animal it might have been. The sun was setting fast, and I quickened my pace, my heart beating a little faster. When I finally found the main trail again, relief washed over me. But then I heard a strange noise, a low, slow crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped and looked around. There was nothing visible through the trees, but the sound was coming from somewhere behind me, moving slowly but steadily closer. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. I didn't want to imagine anything worse. I picked up a sturdy stick from the ground and kept walking, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The sound continued, never speeding up, always steady. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was almost dark. I closed the door behind me and locked it carefully. The cabin felt fragile with all its glass walls. Outside, the trees pressed close, black and still in the night. I sat by the window watching the shadows. The crunching sound outside had stopped, but I felt eyes on me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me jump. The next morning, I found something unsettling. On the small wooden deck outside the cabin door were fresh footprints. They were large, much bigger than mine, and the pattern wasn't like any animal I knew. The prints came right up to the door and stopped, as if whoever made them had been standing there, looking in. I didn't see any other signs. No broken branches, no discarded trash, no clues about how long the prints had been there. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but still none. That day, I stayed mostly inside, watching the woods. I took pictures of the footprints and the surrounding area. There was no obvious path or trail leading to the cabin that I could see. It was as if the visitor had come through the woods in a way that left almost no trace except those prints. I kept hearing noises at night. Footsteps, snapping twigs, low growls or groans that might have been animals or something else. I tried not to think about it. I told myself I was safe inside the cabin, that whoever or whatever was out there couldn't get in. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger every hour. The glass walls felt like a prison, exposed and vulnerable. I thought about leaving, but I was too far from town, and I didn't want to risk walking through the woods at night. On the third day, I noticed something new. There were small piles of stones arranged near the cabin. I didn't put them there. They were neat, like someone had deliberately placed them. Sometimes, I found broken twigs or pieces of bark arranged carefully on the deck railing, as if someone was marking territory or leaving messages. I felt trapped. I didn't want to call for help because I wasn't sure what I would say. Who would believe that someone was watching me from the woods without ever showing themselves? And what would happen if I tried to leave? The nights were the worst. The noises outside were louder and more persistent. I stayed up until dawn, clutching my stick and flashlight, watching the dark shapes in the trees. One night, I thought I saw a figure. A man with short hair, maybe in his 40s or 50s, standing just beyond the tree line. I blinked, and he was gone. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more carefully, looking for any clues about who this person might be. I found an old, overgrown dirt road about a quarter mile from the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but there were tire tracks faintly visible in the mud. Someone had driven close to the cabin recently. I followed the road back toward the main highway but stopped after a few hundred yards. I didn't want to get lost again, and besides, I was scared. The woods felt too quiet and too empty in the daylight, like everything was waiting for something. That night, the noises changed. Instead of just footsteps and snapping branches, I heard voices, low murmurs, too far away to make out words, but definitely human. They were outside the cabin, circling around, moving slowly. I sat frozen behind the glass, heart pounding. I thought about all the horror stories I'd heard about people getting stalked in the woods, about survival and danger. This was real. This wasn't a story. Suddenly, the cabin's glass walls seemed less like protection and more like a spotlight. Anyone outside could see me perfectly. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for dawn, watching the shadows until the first light filtered through the trees. In the morning, I made a decision. I packed my things quietly, keeping an eye on the woods. The footprints were back, fresh and large, and the piles of stones had multiplied. Someone was definitely close. I left the cabin, locking the door behind me. The forest was still and silent. I moved quickly along the dirt road I had found, following it toward the highway. After what felt like hours, I reached a paved road and eventually flagged down a passing car. The driver was kind and agreed to take me to the nearest town. Back in civilization, I reported what had happened to the local sheriff. They took the footprints and some pictures, but there was no evidence of who had been watching me. The area around the cabin was known for occasional hunters and hikers, but no one admitted to being near the cabin recently. The sheriff told me to be careful if I ever went back. The woods could be dangerous in unexpected ways. I never went back to that cabin, but sometimes late at night, I still think about the man with short hair in the woods. The way he watched me without ever showing himself fully. The way the glass walls trapped me inside, visible and vulnerable. I learned something important out there in the woods. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people, and real danger can come from just being alone and exposed in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing: I was lucky to get away. My name is Caleb. I was 32 years old in the summer of 2012 when I took the seasonal park ranger job in the North Cascades National Park in Washington State. It was my third season there, and I knew the land pretty well by then. I liked the job for many reasons. The fresh air, the quiet, the feeling of being alone in a huge forest that stretched on for miles and miles. I liked the hard work, the hiking, and the little cabin that the Park Service had given me to stay in, deep in a remote part of the park called Eagle Creek. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of logs with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a bunk bed. It was off the grid. No electricity, no running water, just a pump well outside, and a small solar panel on the roof that charged a battery to power a couple of lights. I liked the peace it brought, though at times it could feel lonely. Still, I had my supplies, a good radio, and the occasional check-in with the main ranger station a few miles down the trail. One hot August day, I was on patrol, hiking the Eagle Creek Trail as I often did, checking for campers, looking for fire hazards, and making sure no one was breaking park rules. It was around 10 a.m. when I noticed something odd about the trail. The usual foot traffic was very light for a weekend, and there were no fresh campfires or trash along the way. That didn't sit right with me. Normally, this trail was popular, especially in the summer. As I walked, I heard the faint sound of water rushing. A small creek runs alongside the trail. The sunlight filtered through the dense trees, casting long shadows, and I felt the familiar damp smell of moss and pine needles. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle and then continued. About 2 miles in, I found something that made me freeze. A small campsite, but abandoned, with no sign of recent use. There was a fire pit, but the ashes were cold and gray, old and untouched. A few empty food wrappers and a torn backpack lay nearby. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I took out my radio and tried to call the main station, but all I got was static. That was unusual. The radio usually worked fine here. I checked the battery. It was full. The trees around were thick and tall, but I had never had this much trouble with reception before. I decided to continue to the cabin. It was still another 3 miles up the trail, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right there. I moved cautiously, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of people, any movement. When I finally reached the cabin, the silence was heavy. No smoke from the chimney, which was normal since I had no fire going today. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and damp earth, but nothing else seemed out of place. I sat down on the bed, pulled out a sandwich from my pack, and ate slowly, still listening for sounds outside. Then I heard it, a rustling noise coming from just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. It was subtle but distinct, not the usual sounds of birds or wind. Something moving in the bushes. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. The sun was still high, but I didn't want to wait until nightfall to see what was out there. I stepped outside, the forest pressing close around me. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and bushes. I shone the flashlight into the shadows, but saw nothing. Then I heard the noise again, this time closer, coming from the trees to my left. I followed the sound cautiously, moving quietly. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and I tried not to snap twigs underfoot. Then I saw it, something white moving quickly between the trees. It was too fast to be a deer or a bear. My heart started to race. I raised my voice, shouting, "Hey!" But no response, only silence. I waited for several minutes, shining the light in all directions. Nothing. I walked back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. The feeling of being watched crawled up my spine. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm myself. That night, I lay awake in the dark cabin. The only sounds were the distant calls of owls and the rustle of wind through the trees. I kept the flashlight and a knife close by. My radio was dead quiet. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, outside the cabin door. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint tapping on the wooden wall. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out, but fear froze me. The tapping continued for a few moments, then stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn came, I opened the door cautiously. No one was there, but I found something strange on the porch. A single dirty shoe print, too large to be mine. It led away from the cabin into the forest and then disappeared. I packed up some essentials and prepared to hike back to the ranger station. I knew the area well enough to make it in about half a day. Before leaving, I checked the radio one more time, and it finally worked again. I called in my location and situation, reporting the strange noises and signs. The radio crackled with the voice of my supervisor, telling me a search team was being sent to check the area. Apparently, a hiker had gone missing near Eagle Creek a week earlier, and the Park Service was worried. The abandoned campsite I had found was likely linked to that. I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief that help was coming, unease because someone had been out there, close to the cabin, watching me. I didn't see anyone clearly, but the footprints and sounds were proof enough. I left the cabin that morning, walking briskly down the trail. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, and I kept my senses sharp. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was met by the team and gave them all the details. The search went on for several days. They found signs of the missing hiker's passage, but no clear trace of him. The area was rugged and the forest was dense. It was easy to get lost or injured out there. After that summer, I never returned to that cabin at Eagle Creek. The experience stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the footsteps outside my door, the abandoned campsite. It was a reminder that sometimes the forest holds dangers you can't see clearly, and that being alone in the wild means respecting the unknown. It was the fall of 2019 when my business partner, Mark, and I decided to take a break from the city chaos. We had been pushing hard for months, running a small but growing tech consultancy. The stress was piling up, and neither of us had taken time off for a long while. Mark suggested a cabin getaway, something quiet and remote where we could clear our heads, think about the future, and maybe come up with some new ideas. I agreed immediately. Mark found a small cabin near Mill Creek, about 2 hours northwest of Seattle. It wasn't fancy, just a modest wooden cabin with basic amenities, sitting alone in a dense forest. The location was perfect for what we needed. Peace, no distractions, and time away from the endless emails and meetings. The cabin had no cell service, which was a major selling point. We left early on a Friday morning, carrying just enough clothes and supplies for 2 nights. The sky was clear, crisp autumn air filled the car as we drove. I remember feeling the tension start to ease the moment we left the city behind. The freeway slowly turning into narrow country roads lined with tall pine trees. When we arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt driveway leading to the cabin. The place was surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with the creek itself running about 100 yards behind. The cabin looked worn but sturdy, built maybe 50 years ago, with faded paint and a chimney that still had some black soot stains. Mark had booked it through a local rental service, and it felt remote enough to disconnect completely. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms. The furniture was simple, old wooden chairs, a rickety dining table, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and make the most of the evening. That night, after a quick dinner of canned soup and bread, we sat near the fire, laptops closed, phones off. It was silent except for the crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. The quiet was soothing at first, but soon it started to feel heavy. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound. The wind rustling the leaves, the creek's steady murmur, and a distant thud somewhere in the woods. I didn't say anything, but Mark looked uneasy too. The next day, we woke to overcast skies and a light drizzle. We spent the morning hiking a trail near the creek, trying to clear our minds. The forest was dense, filled with towering firs and moss-covered rocks. The damp earth smelled fresh but also cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. We didn't talk much, just focused on the walk and the rhythm of our steps. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest slick and shiny. We returned to the cabin, both feeling a little restless. We had planned to work on some business ideas during this time, but something about the isolation was creeping in. The cabin was quiet again, but now it felt different, more oppressive. Around dusk, I noticed the old windows weren't sealed well. The wind rattled the frames, and a faint chill filled the room. Mark lit the fireplace again, and we tried to concentrate on some rough sketches and notes. But the fire flickered oddly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The woods outside grew darker, thicker. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping near the cabin, soft footsteps on the gravel outside, a distant low growl maybe. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else. Mark was asleep in the next room, snoring quietly, but I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. At some point, I got up to check the front door. The old wooden door had a rusty latch, and when I peered out through the cracked window, the forest looked like a black wall. No moon, just endless darkness. The porch light was on but barely lit the steps. Then I noticed it. A figure, maybe 50 yards away, standing just beyond the tree-line. I froze, heart pounding. The figure was motionless, like watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks after all the silence and shadows. I locked the door, turned on every light, and went back to bed. Morning came reluctantly, with gray skies and a cold drizzle again. I told Mark about the figure I saw, but he brushed it off as nerves and isolation messing with me. He was right. Maybe it was just a deer or a lost hiker. Still, the unease lingered. That day, we tried to focus on work again, but something was off. The cabin felt watched. Outside, the forest seemed too still, like it was holding its breath. When we took breaks, I scanned the tree line, looking for anything unusual. Late afternoon brought something worse. While fetching water from the nearby creek, I noticed strange footprints in the mud. They weren't animal prints, they were human, but the size was larger than any normal person's foot. Deep, heavy impressions, as if someone had stomped through the mud quickly. The prints led from the forest edge toward the cabin, then disappeared near the back porch. I showed Mark, but he shrugged it off again, saying maybe it was a hunter or a lost traveler. Still, neither of us had seen any cars or people nearby in the past 2 days. The area was supposed to be deserted. That evening, we locked every window and door. We made sure the fire was roaring. But just before midnight, the noises started again. Soft footsteps circling the cabin, scratching sounds on the wooden walls, a low, deliberate tapping at the window. I stayed quiet, heart racing, waiting for Mark to wake up, but he didn't. I crept to the window, trying to see outside without shining a light. The tapping stopped. The footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep much that night. The final day we were there, the rain came down heavy and steady. We packed quickly, eager to leave. On the way back to the car, I took one last look at the forest, feeling like we'd been watched the entire time. When we drove away, the city lights were a relief. Mark and I agreed we'd never mention what happened at the cabin to anyone. It wasn't ghosts or spirits, just real people. People we didn't want to run into again. My name is Thomas Redding. I'm 34 now, but this happened back in October of 2016, when I was 25. I had just quit my job in Portland, Oregon. It wasn't some dramatic life change. I wasn't chasing a dream or escaping anything poetic. I was just tired. Tired of sitting in front of a screen, tired of rush hour traffic, tired of having my life on someone else's schedule. I had a bit of savings, enough to buy land and build something simple. That was my only plan. Get out into the woods, clear my head, and build a small off-grid cabin. The land I bought was a couple of acres tucked into the Cascade foothills, about 15 miles off the main road near a town called Mill Creek. It wasn't entirely isolated, but you'd never find it by accident. There were no neighbors in sight, no cell service, and the road to get there was a narrow dirt path with potholes big enough to eat a wheel. I drove out with my old Chevy truck packed with hand tools, lumber, a canvas tent, and enough canned food to last a few weeks. I figured I'd rough it for a while, live in the tent, chop some wood, and build something small by hand. I wasn't trying to make anything fancy, just a dry space to sleep in with 4 walls and a roof. I set up camp near a slight slope, far enough from the creek to avoid flooding but close enough to carry water. It was late afternoon when I got the tent up. The air was chilly, early fall chill where you can feel winter creeping up. I could smell the pine trees and the cold soil. The only sounds were wind and the occasional bird. No cars, no people. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire, heated a can of beans, and sat staring at the flames until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The first week was slow but productive. I cleared brush and started laying out a simple foundation using pressure-treated 4x4 posts. I dug the post holes by hand, slow, back-breaking work. I'd wake up sore and go to bed sore, but it felt better than anything I'd done in years. By the 10th day, I had the floor joists in and started framing the walls. I didn't have any power tools, just a handsaw, a hammer, a square, and some nails. I worked in layers, framing one wall, then another until the shell started taking shape. It wasn't much, but it started to look like something that could hold off the wind. Then the weather turned. I remember waking up early on the 12th day. The sky looked heavy. Low, gray clouds stretched all the way to the ridge. I could smell the rain coming before it hit. I worked fast that day, trying to get a tarp up over the frame. I managed to hang it from some nearby trees and drape it over the top to keep the floor dry. It wasn't perfect, but it would help. That night, the rain came hard. It started as a steady patter on the tent and turned into a relentless downpour. Wind pushed the rain sideways. The temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and listened to the storm hammer the trees. At some point after midnight, the wind ripped a corner of the tarp off and it snapped back and forth like a flag. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't sleep. By morning, everything was soaked. The tarp had collapsed in the middle and dumped water onto the subfloor. Mud had started pooling near the posts. My tent was damp and all my firewood was wet. I felt cold down to the bone, even with 3 layers on. Still, I didn't come out here to quit. I got to work trying to fix what I could. I built a better support for the tarp and dug a shallow trench to divert water around the foundation. My gloves were soaked through within minutes. My boots, too. But I worked for hours, alone and quiet, teeth clenched. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I'd leave my tools in a certain spot and come back to find one moved slightly. Or I'd hear a branch snap off to the side and nothing would be there. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe I kicked the hammer and forgot, that animals moved through the trees all the time. Nothing strange about that. But then one morning, I woke up and found my axe missing. It had been leaning against a tree just outside the tent. I searched the entire area. I checked the bushes, under the tarp, even inside the frame of the cabin. Nothing. That wasn't the kind of thing you misplace. It had a bright orange handle. I should have seen it even half buried. I told myself it must have fallen or rolled downhill. Still, I had a hard time focusing that day. I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt tighter somehow, like the trees were leaning in. 2 days later, I found it. Not near the cabin, but 50 yards down the slope, stuck blade first into a stump. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone else, just the axe, clean and sharp, right there like someone planted it. That was the first time I really felt scared. I stopped working after dark. I double-checked my tools, made sure they were all accounted for every night. I kept my campfire smaller. I listened more. Every night the woods got quieter, like even the animals were watching. The rain kept falling on and off, and the mud made everything harder. One of the days, I slipped carrying a beam and slammed my elbow on a rock. It swelled up fast, and I had to wrap it with a bandage and rest for 2 days. I thought about leaving, just packing up and driving out, but I'd already sunk everything into the land. I didn't want to go back to the city with nothing, so I stayed. I worked slower, more carefully. I finally got the walls up and the roof started. I used metal sheets and framed a simple pitch to keep the water off. It wasn't finished, but I could finally sleep inside the cabin shell. I laid my sleeping bag on the plywood floor and kept the tent for storage. The first night in the cabin was calm. The wind pushed against the walls, but it felt sturdy. I finally had a dry place, but at some point around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't rain. It was footsteps, slow, heavy ones circling the outside of the cabin. I held my breath and sat up. The footsteps stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my ears. Then I heard it again, this time near the back wall. Just one step, then silence. I didn't have a gun, just a hunting knife and a hatchet. I stayed completely still for maybe half an hour. Eventually, the sound faded, or maybe it never came back. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside. The ground was soaked and muddy, but I couldn't see any clear prints. I walked the perimeter twice, then 3 times. Nothing, just wet earth and pine needles. Still, I knew what I'd heard. I spent the rest of that day gathering firewood and reinforcing the door frame. I made a simple latch out of scrap metal and installed a crossbar. That night, I brought everything inside. Every tool, every supply. I even moved some heavy rocks to block the window openings. That night, the rain came down harder than ever. It sounded like nails on the metal roof. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, slower, and then something brushed the front door, just a soft scrape, like fingers dragging wood. I didn't move. I held the hatchet close, listening. No more footsteps, no voice, just that long, deliberate scrape. The rain masked the sound after that, and I never heard anything again that night. In the morning, I checked the door. Mud was smeared on the bottom edge. It wasn't an animal. Too high up, too narrow to be a paw. More like the outline of a hand. I didn't waste any time. I packed what I could, threw everything into the truck, and drove straight to the sheriff's office in Mill Creek. I reported it. The missing axe, the footsteps, the handprint. The deputy didn't say much, just took notes and promised to send someone out. A week later, they called me, said they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. I didn't go back for 3 months. When I finally did, everything was the same. The cabin was still standing. Some leaves had blown inside, and a few boards were damp. But no signs of damage, no handprints, no missing tools. I stayed again that night just to see. It was quiet. After that, I kept building. I finished the roof, added a wood stove, sealed the windows. I even put in a small solar panel. But I never stayed unarmed again. I bought a rifle. I learned how to track prints. I always locked the door. To this day, I don't know if someone was messing with me, or if I was just being watched. Maybe a local saw me and decided to scare me off. Or maybe someone had been living in those woods long before I bought the land. I don't know. What I do know is that I finished the cabin. It stands strong today. I live in it part-time. When I want quiet, I go there. It still rains a lot, and sometimes I think I hear things at night. But I built something with my hands. And even though it scared the hell out of me, I didn't quit. I came back. I made it mine. That's the only thing that matters now. I was 34 that year, tired of how things were going in my life and just looking for some space away from the constant noise. I'd been working a job I didn't care about in Bristol, doing the same thing every day. I didn't hate it, but it drained me. It felt like I was slowly disappearing into a routine I hadn't agreed to. Nothing bad had happened, no breakup, no family death, nothing that dramatic. But that was part of the problem. Everything just felt blank. I needed something quiet, something to shake things up, or at least clear my head. A friend of mine, Sam, had told me about this old cabin in the hills near Llanidloes. Whales, which wasn't far from the border with England. It was tucked in a forested area, about a mile and a half off a back road, up a dirt path. He'd stayed there a couple of years earlier when he was going through his own burnout. Said it was perfect. Remote, no internet, no cell signal, just trees and quiet. He gave me the name of the woman who owned it, Mrs. Horwood, and said I could reach her by writing a letter of all things. So I did. A week later, I got a handwritten reply, short and neat, saying the place was available for the 2 weeks I asked about in October. She left a key in a metal box nailed to the underside of the porch and said to leave cash in the drawer by the fireplace. £120 for the week. A steal, really. I packed the basics. Warm clothes, some tins of beans, soup, rice, a small camping stove in case the power went out, my old sleeping bag just in case the mattress was bad, and 2 books. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except Sam, and even then I kept it vague. Took about 4 hours to drive there. The final mile and a half of the trip was slow and rough. My car isn't built for muddy dirt paths, and I nearly bottomed out twice. But the trees opened up near the top, and the cabin sat in a small clearing. It wasn't big. Maybe 2 rooms and a kitchen, all wood, with dark red trim that had peeled in long strips. But it had a solid roof, and the porch looked sturdy enough. The air was colder than in Bristol, sharper. I didn't mind. I found the key just like she said. Inside, the place smelled like dust and wood. The main room had a wood stove and a small couch with a heavy wool blanket over the back. The kitchen was old but clean. A kettle sat on the stove, and 2 mismatched mugs were stacked beside it. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar. Everything was quiet, just the wind in the trees. I settled in easily. I made tea, lit a small fire in the wood stove, and read until the sun dipped below the trees. Then I made some rice and beans, ate in silence, and went to bed early. The first few days were peaceful. I walked the trails that wound through the trees, made simple meals, read, and slept. I hadn't realized how little I'd been sleeping before. Out here, with no phone buzzing, no lights flashing, nothing to do but exist, I slept deeply. The silence at night was complete. Sometimes the wind picked up, and the trees would creak. A couple of times I heard an owl, but mostly it was dead quiet. On the 4th night, I stayed up a bit later than usual. I'd started keeping the fire going into the night because the air dropped fast once the sun was gone. Around midnight, I was lying on the couch under the wool blanket, just staring at the fire, letting my thoughts drift, when I thought I saw movement outside the window. It was just a flicker, maybe a shadow, maybe the wind, but it pulled me out of my calm. I sat up slowly and looked out through the glass. Nothing, just trees swaying gently in the dark. I got up and stepped onto the porch. Cold air bit at my face. I didn't see anything. After a minute or 2, I went back inside, chalked it up to firelight messing with my eyes, and went to bed. The next morning, I walked the trail again, longer this time. I wanted to tire myself out. I wandered off the path a bit, just exploring. At one point, I came across a thick patch of brambles and, beyond it, what looked like an old stone wall. I pushed through and found what must have once been a small structure. Just the remains of 4 stone corners and a pile of moss-covered wood in the center. Maybe an old shed or barn. I looked around a bit but didn't stay long. It felt odd. Not dangerous, just stale. Forgotten. That evening, just after the sky went dark, I went to bring in some firewood. That's when I saw her. She was standing just inside the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the porch. I didn't hear her approach. She was thin, wrapped in what looked like a dark green coat that hung loose on her body. Her hair was long, gray or dirty blonde, tangled, and hanging over part of her face. She wasn't moving, just standing and watching me. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just stood there holding the armload of wood, my breath fogging in the cold air. After maybe 10 seconds, She turned slowly and stepped back into the trees. Her movement wasn't fast, just calm and deliberate, like she wasn't worried I'd follow. And I didn't. Inside, I locked the door, latched the windows, and sat in the middle of the room with the fire burning. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I looked for tracks, but the ground was packed with leaves and damp soil. I didn't find anything.
No footprints.
No signs of anyone walking through. Still, I kept telling myself maybe she was a hiker, someone camping in the woods. The thought didn't make much sense. It was cold, and this place was far from any trailheads, but it was better than the other possibility, that someone was watching me on purpose. That evening, I closed the curtains early. I didn't light the fire until after dark. I wanted to see out before anything could see in. I made tea, sat at the table, and waited. I didn't want to admit I was hoping she wouldn't come back. Around 10, I heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of dragging sound, soft and slow. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Then silence. I sat still, holding my breath. Then there was a knock. Not hard, just 2 light taps on the wall beside the kitchen window. I didn't move. The knock didn't come again. I stayed up the whole night. By morning, I felt hollow. I stepped outside with a knife in my coat pocket and walked the perimeter. Nothing. I started to think I was imagining things, or at least exaggerating them in my head. Being alone in a place like this can mess with you. I knew that. Still, I packed my bag. I didn't leave. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. I didn't want to feel like I was running. That seemed important at the time. That day passed slow. I barely ate. I kept looking at the window, then the trees, then the porch. At sunset, I built a fire, closed the curtains tight, and brought the kettle to a boil. Just after midnight, I heard the front steps creak. Then nothing. I moved to the couch, heart racing, and sat there for what felt like hours. When the sun finally started to rise, I opened the door. There were prints on the porch. Not shoe prints, just impressions, bare feet. Thin, narrow, with the toes spaced wide. The boards were damp with dew, and the prints stood out clearly. They'd walked from the far end of the porch to the front door, then back. I left 20 minutes later. Didn't make tea, didn't clean up. I grabbed my stuff, locked the door even though I knew it wouldn't matter, and drove down the dirt path without stopping. My car nearly slid off the track twice, but I didn't care. Back in Bristol, I stayed in my flat for 3 days straight. I told Sam what had happened, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he'd never seen anyone out there, but once, he thought he heard someone humming in the woods. He'd left the next day and never gone back. I didn't tell anyone else. I didn't call Mrs. Horwood or ask for a refund. I mailed the money like I said I would. Weeks passed, then months. I tried to forget, but sometimes at night, I still see her in my mind, just standing at the edge of the trees, quiet, waiting, not hiding, not threatening, just watching, like she belonged there, like I was the one who didn't. And the worst part, I think she knew I wouldn't stay. I think she waited until she was sure I'd leave. My name is Daniel Sutter. I was 41 when this happened, and it's something I still think about every time I hear a branch snap in the woods. This was back in 2019, late October, just before the first snow started to stick in northern Idaho. I had taken some time off work after a stressful quarter. I worked in logistics back then. I'd been divorced for about 4 years. No kids. So when things got heavy, I just got up and left for the woods. It's what I'd always done. I had an old buddy who'd let me use his family's hunting cabin up near the Selway River. It was about a 2-hour drive from Lewiston, where I lived, and then a good 40-minute haul in a high-clearance vehicle to even get to the foot trail. From there, it was maybe 1.5 miles on foot. I'd been there a couple of times before, mostly for elk hunting with friends, but this time I went alone. That wasn't strange for me. I liked the solitude. That's part of why I hunted quiet, clear-headed time away from noise. I left on a Tuesday morning, took my truck up past Elk City, parked just before the old Forest Service gate, and packed in. I brought everything I needed for about 6 days: food, extra fuel for the small generator, my rifle, a backup pistol, fire starting gear, a med kit, 2 radios, one handheld and one mounted in the truck, and a battery pack for my phone, which barely worked out there anyway. There was no reception, but I kept it on for photos and the time. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was a single-room place with a little stove, a table, one cot, and a shelf lined with half-used propane canisters and faded canned goods. There was no electricity unless you ran the generator, and even then you had maybe one light bulb and a plug or two. The whole thing sat maybe 30 yards off a small creek and was backed by dense pine and fir forest. No nearby cabins, no roads beyond the trail, just quiet. The first day was uneventful. I hiked in, settled down, set up my camp stove, and got my gear organized. That night, I heard some elk bugling far off. I figured I'd get an early start the next morning and start tracking from the high ridge a mile south. I slept hard that night, the kind of sleep you only get when there's no sound except the wind brushing the treetops. The second morning, I was out by 6:30. It was cold, frost covering everything. I spent all day slowly moving through the forest, glassing the open cuts in the trees, looking for movement, following signs, fresh scat, broken branches, bedding spots. I didn't see anything up close. By late afternoon, I made my way back. I was about half a mile from the cabin when I thought I saw movement behind me, just for a split second. I stopped and turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited, quiet. Nothing again. I told myself it was a deer or maybe just my imagination. Back at the cabin, I got a fire going inside, ate a quick dinner, freeze-dried beef stew, and turned in early. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to piss. The wind had picked up and was howling through the trees. I stepped outside with a flashlight and walked maybe 20 feet off the porch. The air smelled like damp moss and wood smoke. I did my business, then swept the light around lazily. I stopped when it caught something off to the side. 2 small pale shapes low to the ground, about 30 yards off near the creek. They reflected just a moment, then blinked and disappeared. I figured it was a coyote, maybe a fox. I wasn't too concerned, but I stayed out a little longer, listening. Nothing. I went back inside, locked the door, just a wooden bar and a metal latch, and got back into the sleeping bag. Still, I didn't sleep quite as easy after that. The third day, I hiked north instead. I wanted to stay closer to the creek and see if any game had passed through. I found fresh tracks, a buck, maybe 4-point, judging by the spacing. I followed them for about an hour, then lost them in the thicker brush. Around midday, clouds rolled in. It looked like snow might be coming early. I turned back. It was on the way back that I noticed something off. A tree, maybe 20 inches wide, had fresh gouges in it. Not from an elk's antlers, these were vertical and sharp, maybe a knife. That's what it looked like. About 5 cuts, all starting high and dragging low. I stared at it a long time. Then I noticed a small piece of red cloth stuck to one of the broken branches nearby. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket. Could have been old, I told myself. Could have been nothing. I got back to the cabin around 4. The light was already dying, and the cold was settling in quick. That night, I kept the rifle by the cot and double-checked the latch before I went to bed. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things that night, branches breaking, rustling. Once I sat up and turned on my flashlight, but I didn't go outside. I told myself it was wind, maybe a deer passing through. But deep down, I was starting to feel it, that gnawing tension you try to ignore. The one that comes when something just doesn't feel right. Day 4, I didn't go out hunting. I stayed near the cabin. Spent the morning gathering more wood. Checked the creek for tracks. Nothing fresh. I tried using the handheld radio to check in with anyone, just to feel a little less isolated. No response. I wasn't surprised. The signal barely reached past a couple hills. That afternoon, I went back to where I saw the gouged tree. I wanted to see if I could find anything else. Maybe some trash, boot prints, anything. After about 15 minutes of circling, I saw something maybe 40 yards uphill. A small mound of disturbed ground. It didn't look like an animal digging. It looked deliberate. I climbed up and stood over it. Someone had clearly dug something out there. Maybe 2 feet wide, for feet long. The dirt was loose but damp. There were old boot prints around it. Then I saw something sticking out from the brush just past it. A rusted old hunting knife, the blade half covered in mud, wedged in the roots of a tree. I didn't touch it. I backed off and walked straight back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up with the lantern on, listening. I kept the fire going just to have something to focus on. I felt like I was being watched. I can't explain it better than that. You know when you feel that heat on the back of your neck? Like eyes boring into you? That's what it felt like. Except it wouldn't stop. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Clear footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching over leaves and pine needles. I killed the lantern and froze. The steps came closer, maybe just outside the porch. Then silence. I sat in that darkness for maybe an hour, afraid to move, finger on the trigger. I never heard the steps again. In the morning, I opened the door, rifle up, and swept the area. Nothing. But I walked around the back of the cabin and found footprints. Clear as day. Heavy boots. They led around the back window, paused, then disappeared into the woods. I packed everything in 20 minutes flat. I had planned to stay 2 more nights, but I didn't care. I strapped my rifle, shouldered my gear, and hiked out hard. The whole time I felt eyes on me. I kept checking behind me every 20 steps. I didn't stop once. No food, no breaks. When I got to my truck, I threw everything in the back and got the hell out. I didn't relax until I hit paved road. Back in Lewiston, I tried reporting it to the local ranger office. They took a report, but nothing ever came of it. They figured maybe it was just another hunter, or maybe I got spooked by a bear. But those weren't bear tracks. I went back months later with 2 friends, just to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. We found the same dugout area still partly collapsed. The knife was gone. The gouges in the tree had faded with weather but were still there. I haven't been back since. I still hunt, but never alone. That week changed how I look at the woods. I always used to think the scariest thing you might run into out there was a cougar or a grizzly. But it's not. It's people. People who don't want to be found. People who watch and wait and maybe don't have a reason for what they do. If I'd stayed 1 more night, I don't know what would have happened. I don't want to know. But I can still see those footprints circling the cabin in the dead of night. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in absolute silence. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from my hectic life in Chicago. At 32 years old, working as a graphic designer in a small agency, I was burned out and needed something different. Something quiet, something far from the noise and the crowds. The city was relentless, with its endless traffic jams, shouting, and the constant hum of machines and voices. I had always loved the outdoors, but I rarely found the time to enjoy it. So, after some research, I rented a small cabin in northern Wisconsin, about 100 miles north of Green Bay. It was the kind of place where the trees grew tall and thick, the air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were those made by nature. The cabin was owned by a family who used it as a summer retreat. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, not far from a small, clear lake that shimmered in the afternoon sun. I booked it for 2 weeks in July, hoping to unwind, recharge, and maybe get some inspiration for my work. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, driving down a narrow, winding road that eventually turned to gravel. The last few miles were rough, and my old sedan rattled more than I liked, but I didn't mind. The isolation was part of the appeal. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was exactly as the pictures showed. A small, weathered wooden structure with a sloped roof, a stone chimney on one side, and a small porch with a faded swing. The place smelled like pine and earth, the wood worn smooth by years of wind and rain. I carried my bags inside and took a slow walk around the cabin. There was a small garden patch to the side, but it looked neglected. Wildflowers had grown in places, and some bushes hung over the edges of the porch. The windows were dusty but clear enough to see through. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a dining table, a couch, and a loft bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. There was no electricity except for a small solar panel on the roof, which powered a few basic lights. No internet, no phone signal. Just me, the forest, and the lake. I unpacked slowly and decided to take a walk down to the lake. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cool and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. I walked along a narrow path, the ground soft under my boots, feeling the quiet settle around me like a heavy blanket. When I reached the water, I sat on a flat rock and watched the surface ripple gently with the breeze. A few ducks floated by, and the sound of a loon echoed from deeper in the lake. That night, I built a small fire outside the cabin. I had brought a few cans of beans and some bread, which I ate while listening to the forest sounds. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the walk. The next few days passed in a slow rhythm. I explored the area, took photographs of the trees and the lake, and read old magazines I had brought. I fished in the lake, catching a couple of small perch. I collected firewood and kept the fire burning every evening. The isolation was comforting at first. No emails, no phone calls, no deadlines. Just the forest and me. But then, on the third night, something changed. I had gone to bed earlier than usual because I felt a bit tired. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the flickering embers of the dying fire outside, visible faintly through the window. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A noise outside, very faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound repeated, slow and deliberate, a crunching of leaves or twigs, coming closer to the cabin. I froze, listening hard. The cabin was silent except for the noise outside. Stopped for a moment, then started again. Closer this time. I didn't move, my heart beating fast. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, just wandering nearby, but something felt off. The noise circled the cabin, slow and steady. The twigs snapped under heavy footsteps, uneven but sure. I looked out the window, but the thick darkness and the shadows of the trees made it impossible to see clearly. I waited, but whatever was out there stayed quiet after that, and eventually the night returned to its usual sounds. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made me jump. I kept checking the locks on the cabin door, making sure the windows were shut tight. But when morning came, I saw nothing unusual. No footprints in the dirt near the cabin, no broken branches, no signs of anything or anyone. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just the forest, after all. But the next night, the noises came again. This time, they were louder and more persistent. I was sitting on the porch after dinner, reading a book by flashlight, when I heard the sound of footsteps coming down the path toward the cabin. I stopped reading and looked up, but the darkness swallowed everything. My flashlight beam scanned the edge of the woods, but I saw no one. Still, the footsteps got closer and closer, until I could hear them crunch on the gravel driveway just a few yards from where I sat. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't have a phone, and I was miles from the nearest neighbor. I considered shouting, but my voice caught in my throat. I grabbed a heavy stick from nearby and stayed on the porch, shining the flashlight toward the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent. I didn't see anyone. The woods were empty. For the rest of the night, I sat on the porch, flashlight ready, fire burning low beside me. I didn't sleep again. The next day, I decided to explore further into the woods, trying to understand what was happening. I packed some water, a small knife, and my camera. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and the forest looked peaceful. I took a deep breath and walked down a new trail I had not seen before. The path twisted and turned, narrow and overgrown in places. The trees were tall, their branches creating a thick canopy overhead. Birds sang, and the occasional squirrel darted past. After about an hour, I stopped at a small clearing and looked around. That's when I noticed the marks. Near the edge of the clearing, on a fallen tree, there were deep scratches. The bark was stripped away in long, rough lines, as if made by claws or a sharp object. The ground nearby was disturbed, with fresh dirt turned up. But there were no animal tracks, no deer, no bear, nothing that matched the size or shape of those scratches. I took pictures and looked carefully around. Then I noticed something else. A pile of broken branches and leaves, arranged in a rough circle, like someone had tried to build a crude shelter or hideout. A sudden chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a quiet forest anymore. Someone had been here recently, and not just passing through. I hurried back to the cabin, my nerves on edge. That night, the noises returned, louder than before. They circled the cabin, moving slowly, sometimes stopping as if listening or watching. I could hear the sound of branches snapping, leaves rustling, and heavy breathing. I stayed inside, doors locked, windows shuttered. I kept my knife close, and my heart pounded all night. On the fifth night, the footsteps stopped. Instead, I heard something else, whispers low and indistinct, coming from the woods. I couldn't understand the words, but they were close, just beyond the tree line. I wanted to run, but I was stuck, trapped in this small cabin with no one around to help. The sixth day, I found a small radio in the cabin's kitchen drawer. It was old, dusty, and barely worked, but I managed to get a faint signal from a local station. The DJ was talking about a missing person, an older man who had disappeared in the area 2 weeks before. The police had found his truck abandoned near a trail, but no sign of the man. I realized then how isolated I was, and how little help I could expect. That night, I stayed awake all night, listening to every sound, gripping my knife. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes watching me. I heard a distant shout, human, desperate, maybe angry. It echoed and faded, leaving a ringing silence. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. The peace I had hoped for was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. I packed my bags quickly, dreading the long drive back to the city, but relieved to be moving. As I locked the cabin door behind me, I took one last look around. The forest was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me down the narrow gravel road. I didn't. That summer, I learned how thin the line was between calm and chaos in places like that. The woods are beautiful, but they hide dangers beyond animals and storms. People sometimes get lost or trapped, and sometimes others are watching from the shadows. My experience wasn't a ghost story or a fairy tale. It was real life, raw, uncomfortable, and unpredictable. I never found out who or what had been around the cabin those nights, and I never went back. But the memory of that forest, the feeling of being watched and alone, stayed with me for years. And sometimes, when I'm in a crowded city and hear a strange noise in the night, I remember those dark woods in Wisconsin, and I'm glad I'm far away from them. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and head to a small, remote cabin near Lake Monroe in northern Indiana. I was 27 at the time, working a monotonous desk job in Chicago that drained most of my energy and will to live. The idea of spending a week away from people in the quiet woods felt like the perfect way to reset. The cabin was owned by a family friend, a man named Bill, who had inherited it from his grandfather but didn't use it much. Bill gave me the keys, and I promised I'd take care of the place while I was there. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of dark timber and looking older than it probably was. It stood about a mile from the lake, surrounded by dense forest. The road to it was rough, just dirt and gravel, with tall pine trees closing in on both sides. It felt isolated, but that was exactly why I wanted to be there. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was painted with orange and purple streaks, the kind you see only in places without city lights to drown out the colors. As I pulled up in my old Honda, I noticed the cabin looked even smaller than I'd imagined. A thin column of smoke was rising from the stone chimney, though there was no one else around. The air smelled sharp with pine and the faint, clean scent of the lake nearby. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen area, a worn wooden table, a couple of chairs, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a stone fireplace took up most of the main room. Upstairs was a loft with a bed, and below the cabin was a dirt basement that I decided not to enter. Bill had told me there was some old stuff down there, but it wasn't in good shape. I locked the basement door and didn't think much more about it. After lighting a fire, I unpacked a few things and settled in. The cabin had no electricity or running water, so I brought bottled water, canned food, and a small gas stove. I wanted to be off the grid completely, to forget about phones and computers. The first night was peaceful, almost perfect. The quiet was absolute, except for the crackling fire and distant sounds of crickets and frogs. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The forest was thick and silent in a way that made you hyper-aware of every little noise. Branches snapped underfoot, leaves rustled, and somewhere far off a woodpecker hammered a tree. I walked to the lake, which was just as beautiful as I expected. Clear water stretched wide, reflecting the blue sky and tall trees. I spent hours fishing and reading a battered paperback novel I had brought along. At night, I made sure the fire was strong. The wind picked up occasionally, shaking the trees and making the cabin creak. I told myself it was all normal, old wood settling, nature doing its thing. But sometimes, I felt eyes watching from the shadows just outside the window. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, fueled by too many horror movies from years before. On the third day, something shifted. The forest no longer felt like a peaceful refuge. I woke before dawn, a cold sweat on my skin. The wind was louder, blowing through the trees like a warning. Outside, the ground was wet from an overnight rain, the dirt road now muddy and slippery. I stepped outside to check the weather and noticed deep tire tracks in the mud. Fresh, big tire tracks. No one had been expected, and Bill hadn't mentioned anyone else coming near the cabin. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a ranger or another camper had passed by. Still, it bothered me. I locked all the doors and windows more tightly than before. Throughout the day, I kept hearing distant noises, footsteps crunching on leaves, branches breaking. But whenever I looked out, there was nothing there. By the fourth night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest seemed darker, thicker somehow, the shadows longer. I barely slept. The only light came from the fire and a small lantern I had brought. Every sound made me jump. Twice, I thought I saw movement beyond the tree line. A flash of something moving quickly, too fast to be a deer or a fox. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself I was alone and safe inside the cabin. But the unease was creeping under my skin. The next morning, I found something chilling on the doorstep. A crude pile of rocks arranged in a small circle, with a single, fresh deer bone resting on top. I don't know why, but it unsettled me deeply. I had never seen anything like it before. It wasn't a random animal's remains. Someone had placed it there deliberately. My mind raced. Was it a warning? A prank? Or something worse? I checked my phone. No signal. No way to call anyone. The nearest town was miles away, and the road was muddy and narrow. I thought about leaving, but the car was stuck in thick mud from the rain, wheels spinning uselessly. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside, afraid to go outside except to check the perimeter cautiously. I kept the fire burning constantly and stacked more wood by the door. I found an old hunting knife in the kitchen drawer, rusty but still sharp, and kept it close. The sounds outside grew more frequent. Footsteps, whispers carried by the wind, and sometimes faint voices I couldn't understand. On the 6th night, things escalated. Just after midnight, I woke up to loud banging on the front door. It was heavy, forceful, like someone was trying to break in. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed the knife and approached the door quietly, peering through a crack in the curtains. Outside, no one was there. I opened the door slowly, half expecting someone to rush in. The porch was empty, but muddy footprints led away into the trees. Fear gripped me harder than ever. I realized I was being watched, maybe even stalked, by someone in the woods. The idea that this could be a random person made my blood run cold. I had no way to call for help, no neighbors nearby. The forest that had felt like a refuge was now a trap. I spent the rest of the night in the loft, clutching the knife and listening for any sounds. None came after that, but I didn't sleep. At dawn, I tried the car again. With some effort, I managed to free it from the mud, and I didn't hesitate. I drove down the bumpy road as fast as I could, glancing nervously into the trees the whole way. When I reached the nearest gas station, I called Bill and told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, then explained that sometimes hunters or others trespassed on the land, but he had never heard of anything like what I described. He suggested I report it to the local sheriff. I did. The sheriff came out a few days later, searching the area, but found no signs of anyone besides me. The rock circle and deer bone were gone. The footprints disappeared at the edge of the woods. I never went back to the cabin at Lake Monroe. The experience stayed with me for years. The feeling of being watched, the banging at the door, the sense that someone had been waiting for me out there. In time, I realized that the woods had no monsters or ghosts, just people. And sometimes, people are far scarier than any story.